I'm going to have you do before Scott asks you a question. Can you state and spell your name, please?
Ashley Cowger, ASHLEY COWGER.
If you can tell us where you work.
I work in Indianapolis Public Schools as a special ed director.
Ready?
Yep.
So you've seen these questions already.
Yeah.
I'm not popping anything new to you, but if I hear something interesting, or one of us may be like, "Oh, talk more about that." Like, that's really interesting.
Yep.
But let's just start with the first one. So what made you decide to become a special ed teacher?
The challenge of teaching in a special education setting. I'd realized over the course of time, even in my own education, that we had a lot of kids segregated from the general population because they were a little bit extra special in maybe having an academic challenge or having a behavioral challenge. And to me, it was about equity and providing a great education for all of our students and not just the students who are typically developing.
Yep. So I'm sure you have lots of stories of kids that you've impacted, right? Hopefully you've had a chance to think about some of those. So tell us about one of those like real wins that you had as a special ed teacher. Did you outline these things for her, Doc, or not? Did you with Abby?
I broke them down into, it depends on how she answers it.
Yeah, okay.
If you'll remember to recap the question.
Yeah, so tell us about like those great.
One student that I think was the biggest win in my teaching career so far was a student that I had while I was teaching in a self-contained setting for students that had emotional and behavioral conduct disorders. And I had him as a fifth grader. He looped with me as a sixth grader. And he's going to graduate this year from high school, which I'm really excited about. He was a particular challenge because he had no academic challenges. He had physical anxiety. So he would pace in the classroom. He would walk while reading his book. If he became extra stressed, it was not uncommon for him to be underneath the desk and still learning. If I cold called a question, he could answer my question, but his behavior was very different than his typically developing peers. And that was because of something that he'd experienced in his life outside of school. We worked on creating social skills that were strong enough that he could be successful in the regular school environment. We fought really hard to get him into a magnet school in our district, which is basically a school that has extra special curriculum. And the school that he got into was the medical magnet in our district. And he's been so successful. He's still the one student in the school that likes to wear a red shirt when the school colors are still green and black. But we provide the accommodation because we realize that it puts him in a really difficult situation to manage his anxiety if we force the fact that he really should be wearing a different colored shirt. But his ability to cope and his ability to kind of blend in with his typically developing peers has just increased over the course of the years. And I'd kind of lost track of time and was on a school visit a couple of weeks ago and ran into him. And he said, "You realize, Ms. Cowger, that I'm graduating this year?" And I hadn't really thought about it. And I was like, "No way, you're kidding me, you're not graduating." And he's like, "Yes." He's like, "I'm a 12th grader." And I was like, "Do I get to come to your graduation?" And he said, "Yes, of course you get to come to my graduation." And he was telling me about being involved with the plays that the school have going on. He's involved in extracurricular activities. And he's just, I think, the success story, realizing how much work was actually put into that. When you have a student that literally cannot sit in a chair, how do you teach the child?
Joining in the media center in just 2 minutes, so if you could please make your way back. Again, all staff, including special ed assistants and other classified staff, if you could make your way back to the media center at this time. Thank you.
So
You were where it was really challenging to say that was what you're saying.
yeah, so it was really just giving him opportunity to blend in with his peers and recognizing that as adults, we have to perceive students in classrooms differently. I'm an adult where I have a really hard time staying still. So if I'm moving and I'm busy, and I do much better than if I have downtime. So, I kind of empathized with this student and recognizing that he can move and learn at the same time, and recognizing that he absolutely wanted to be with his typically developing peers, but because when he was younger, his behaviors were pretty significant and distracting in the general ed classroom, he was put into this smaller room with me, and the entire purpose being build the skill and then get him back into the general ed environment. For some students, that's a hard transition to make. And when he started working with me, he was in 5th grade, but he'd been in a self-contained setting since he was a 1st grader. So this kid had been in a small classroom until he gets to his adolescent development. And then he's with me realizing like, oh, I get to go to a great school with specialized curriculum and get to be with typically developing peers. It's just a huge win. I think for him, certainly a huge win. But even to just watch how his own confidence increased over the course of the years, and making sure that he had that academic inclusion, which he hadn't had before.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? What did it take on your part as the special ed teacher to learn about what he wanted and that he did want to go into an inclusion setting?
It started with, and I think teaching in general, whether you're a general education teacher or a special education teacher, starts with having a relationship. And so understanding that he loved basketball but could not play basketball to save his life. He was the most uncoordinated child, still kind of is, but he loved basketball and he loved the idea of working out. And so like when I learned that he liked to work out, I had 5-pound hand weights at home that I brought into the classroom, realizing he has to have his physical release in order to stay focused. So it was not uncommon for him to pace around my classroom with a hand weight in one hand and a book in another. And if I cold called, he could give me the answer where we were in the text.
Pardon the interruption. Alicia, if you or some other custodians could grab several waters from the data room, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Text.
Seriously?
Text.
But he just needed that physical release. And he couldn't articulate that to me. He couldn't say, Ms. Cowger, I need to be able to move and learn at the same time. It was me understanding what his likes were first, and me understanding that the only way he's going to be successful is for me to kind of get rid of this idea that kids sit perfectly in chairs and, learn from lecture. And so it was thinking outside the box, but I think the most important through line with all of my students, and it still continues to be, that relationship. If I'm going to ask them to do hard things, like learn algebra and learn geometry, then the least I can do is have a relationship with them where we can be playful and they understand that I like to run and they like to do whatever it is that they like to do. Also, so when those moments get tough, when the academics get really hard, or if we have a crisis in the school, or if there's something happening in the community of concern, that they can lean on me, and that I may not have an answer, but I'm going to help them through it because I care about them.
I have a quick follow-up too. So as part of your original answer, you said we decided to place him. Talk a little bit about, like, as a special ed teacher, you're not in this alone. You have a lot of other adults that work on behalf of these kids. Like, what does that group look like?
Yep. So there are laws and regulations that we follow in special ed. And one of the laws is that the term is case conference committee. The case conference committee is a team of people which include the parent, the special education teacher, general education teachers, the school principal. It's a multidisciplinary team who come together to make sure we're creative in our thinking about how to support a child. We come together and we troubleshoot. We might write a goal for a student in their IEP, which is their formal education document, thinking that this is a really great goal for the student, and we get 3 or 4 weeks in and we realize, maybe that's not quite right, or maybe we need to provide an additional service, or maybe we need to have another support person in the building for the student. It's that team, the case conference committee team, that makes those decisions. So when we were looking at school options for this student in particular, it wasn't it wasn't me making the decision, it wasn't the principal, it wasn't the student, it was the student and the parent and me and the general education teacher and our principal and staff from the school that he was going to be going to, so we could make sure that what we did here, which was so successful, can translate into a new school environment, and make sure that the wraparound services that we provided at the elementary level would continue on the middle school grades.
You did a great job of explaining what an IEP was and case conference. You've mentioned some other words that I don't know everybody would know.
Okay.
So could you give us some perspective and tell Scott this answer? Self-contained versus inclusion. What does that look like from a teacher-student
perspective?
Yep. So I think the place we should probably start is recognizing that special education is not a place. Special education is a service. And in order to service kids well, we have what we call the least restrictive environment, which is a setting that allows the child to be most successful. Most students that have special needs are in the general education setting. We have some students where the general education setting isn't going to totally work, so we have a resource setting where the student goes to a classroom for maybe a period or two during the day for some additional, more one-on-one adult support. And then we have students that need a significant amount of adult support, and that's what we call self-contained settings. So generally you have 12 to 15 students, all with very high need, and a classroom teacher with an instructional assistant. And they're multi-grade classrooms. Mine, for example, was 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And the entire goal being that we're going to give this really intense academic and behavioral intervention in this smaller setting in order to put the child back in the general ed setting and let them be successful. So there's a spectrum of settings in special ed. Self-contained is one of the more restrictive settings. And we don't start students there. It's a progression if a student needs it, and the entire goal being let's move them back from a self-contained into a general ed over time as we build skill.
Can I ask? Sorry.
You can.
You talked a bit about the other adults that you have to work with. What are the challenges that come along as the special ed teacher, and how do you overcome those when working with other adults?
Yeah, the challenges in working with the case conference committee team in particular, where we've got a lot of adults who are rallying together to support a child, the biggest challenge is mindset. If we have adults serving kids, doesn't matter if you're a teacher for general ed or special ed, or if you're building principal or a special ed director. If you do not have a mindset that all kids can and will learn with the right adult support and with the right academic support, then it's going to be really hard for us to serve a child well. In my day-to-day work now, that is the biggest barrier to being able to serve kids well. If I'm working with a teacher who thinks because this child has a learning disability that they can't be with their typically developing peers, we have to get past that first before we can actually address academics. And it can be a huge time suck. It can be really frustrating. So I think, laws were established 50 and 60 years ago to provide this opportunity for students to be with their typically developing peers. But we still have adults that have mindsets that they should be in this extra special classroom in the wing of the hallway, where the kindergartners are and they're 5th or 6th graders. So I would say coaching peers and coaching folks within buildings to understand that this is a social justice and civil rights issue, and it's our responsibility as adults to make sure that we're championing having them with having kids with special needs with typically developing peers, and then thinking creatively when something's not working. Let's not throw our hands up and have a fit about it. Let's say, well, we've tried all of these things and it's not working, so what can we try differently now? And it comes back to the mindset. If we're willing to think creatively and champion and just have a understanding that it's their right to have access to all of the things that a child without a disability has, then I think we can make a lot of headway. But because there are adults that have this mindset gap, it's coaching to get them to understand why it's important. And a lot of times when you ask the person the question, how would you feel if you were in this tiny little classroom and didn't get to go to PE with your peers or go to lunch with your peers, I think it starts to unravel the conversation that they may not have ever had with somebody before. So coaching can get through that, certainly.
Nice. So when you were a teacher, what kept you coming back year after year?
Student wins. I think as teachers, we invest a lot in our students. We stay up late grading papers sometimes. In special ed, we're writing IEPs. We're having meetings with our case conference team to problem solve if something's not working with a student. That can be taxing, but it's also what creates the biggest satisfaction when you get it right. And I think in special ed particularly, we don't have a roadmap to say, this is all the curriculum a child's going to learn during the year, and they're going to learn it this week and this week and this week. Sometimes we have to take inadvertent routes through special ed. And when you actually get it, it is the biggest win, because you realize it was a lot of the students' hard work to get there, but there were a whole lot of adults working hard too to make that happen. And I taught general education, and I also taught in special education settings, and I would say my greatest reward came from the special education setting, because it wasn't always easy, and there is no textbook to say here's how to get from point A to point B. It's saying this behavior is a concern, and here's how we're going to address the behavior. And when the student gets the behavior under control, or when the student learns coping skills to manage like a PE classroom that's sensory overload for some students, when they can manage that on their own, it's just the biggest win. It's that moment, that warm and fuzzy moment of like, yes, we got it. And just knowing how many people were involved in getting there is what creates a big win.
So we often hear in education that every student is different, has different needs. What does that mean to you as a special ed teacher, and how do you incorporate that into your work?
It's going to sound oversimplified, but I think it's true. Like, we're all different. How I respond to noises, for example. My husband loves to vacuum, and when he is vacuuming the entire house, it can be sensory overload for me. He's perfectly fine vacuuming all day long and has no problem with the noise. Just recognizing that people are different. It doesn't matter if you have a disability or an eligibility category for special ed. That doesn't matter. It's that we're all individual human beings. There are things that upset us. There are things that we really like. There are things that we strongly dislike. There are subject matter or subject areas that we like or dislike. So I'm not sure that it's actually a special education thing in particular, because even within special ed, I may have 5 kids with the same eligibility. All 5 kids might have learning disabilities, but how they're going to learn is going to be very different between them. Just same thing as adults or general education students. I can't teach a general ed classroom and have 35 kids in my class and try to take one approach to teaching. We're differentiating that based on the different learners we have in the classroom, regardless of special needs or not. The kids with special needs we develop plans for so we can better tackle whatever their challenge is. Where general education, it might be the matter of the relationship. I might know that Whitney is extra sensitive, so how I correct Whitney's behavior is going to be different than how I correct another student's behavior based on how they respond or what their needs are. So I think recognizing that we're all individuals first, and leaving the special ed piece out of it is really important. And then if a child has special needs, then we're taking that into account as we're developing our lessons or planning for behavior systems in our classrooms. But even thinking about being an adult, my peers respond differently to things than I do. I love to be organized. I love to have systems in place. And I have some colleagues that would be more than happy to not have a system for something. So we're constantly adjusting and figuring out, how do we work well together, and recognizing that that's how they learn. They learn by having a million Post-it notes all over the place. I learn by having a nice tracker. So it shouldn't be expected that everybody kind of fits a mold, because as adults and when we get into real life, we don't have that luxury of all fitting into a box. We're differentiating for ourselves even as adults. So I think thinking about students the same way is important.
Nice. So speaking to anyone considering joining the Indianapolis Teaching Fellows Program, finish the following sentence. My students need a teacher who...
My students need a teacher who will be the biggest champion for them. They will champion through behavior challenges, they will champion through academic challenges, and they're going to be the person who shows up to those students' graduation. And the teachers who would work with us or work with our students are the teachers who are willing to invest themselves both personally and professionally in our students to make sure they're successful, in building the bridges with community partners, so that if we need additional service or if we need additional opportunity for students, they're reaching out to do that. with the support of our team and with the support of school staff. But they just really need to be a champion and love kids.
So I think a lot of potential special ed teachers have this feeling, or at least there's a perception that all special ed teachers do is just paperwork. I mean, it's just endless paperwork, and you don't really get a chance to spend much time with kids because you're always just filling out paperwork. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe technology has helped that over the years, like how it's your perspective of the paperwork piece of this?
It's not all paperwork. So if I had to give a ratio, special education is about 70% instruction and supporting students and 30% paperwork. And the paperwork really is a matter of creating a strong plan for a student. So if you don't invest the time in that plan, then the instruction and the support for the student are guaranteed to not be successful. So for myself, I've never perceived the paperwork as a burden. I've perceived it as my opportunity to create a plan. It may not go according to plan once I start implementing it, but creating a plan to try to be as most successful as possible when I'm in front of the students. So having the plan is extremely important, and realizing that your own organizational systems will determine how much time you spend on paperwork. What I see in my day-to-day work is people who are reactive to having conferences for students or developing their individualized education plan, their IEP. People who are reactive and wait until the day before they have to meet a deadline to do their paperwork are the folks that I hear that narrative. Oh, it's so much paperwork, it's so hard. But we have general education teachers that are doing paperwork too. We have secondary ELA teachers, when they assign essays to students, they may have to grade 130 essays. So it's not about the paperwork being a burden. It's about realizing if we have paperwork, it's to be intentional for student success. It's either the planning or it's assessing what students actually know. So I think it's important for people to have their own organizational systems. I gave an example earlier of, my colleague likes to have a million Post-it notes. I like to actually have a planning document. Knowing that about ourselves allows us to stay ahead of things. Instead of, let me just scurry and figure out, I have a deadline in 3 days to have a conference, I'm just going to kind of make it up as I go. That certainly would create stress for somebody in having paperwork to do. And it also depends on the student. Some students we only have to do paperwork for once a year. Other students who might be struggling more, which we can't predict, right? But students who are struggling more, we might have more paperwork to do on them because we're tracking, here's our plan, it didn't work, we're trying this intervention next, that didn't work, so we're trying another intervention, and with that comes paperwork, so we can document what's worked and what's not worked, and be able to share with, if I'm a special educator, which I am, sharing the paperwork with my general ed teacher or with the PE teacher, so they're consistent, and we're all consistent with what we're doing with a student. That requires paperwork, but it's not a burden. It's intentional and thoughtful paperwork.
If I were someone who was thinking about being a teacher, and I came to you and said, "This is Calgary, I'm thinking about being a teacher, and I'm thinking about being a special ed teacher. Should I do that? Should I not do that? Why should I be a special ed teacher? What's your pitch?"
If you came to me saying you wanted to be a special education teacher, I'd probably hug you, because it is the greatest reward for in working with students in general, but then in special ed, because of the creativity that we use to reach a child, really creates our own success. But I think more than anything, the joy in actually working with students. So I think it takes a special person to be a special education teacher. It takes a person who strongly believes in civil rights and social justice. It takes a person who strongly believes that every child should have a great teacher. It also takes somebody who's willing to be creative and thinking outside the box, because special education doesn't always go according to plan. And it takes a person who really wants that student to have access to all of the academic curriculum, all of the extracurricular activities. It really takes a person who is going to do what it takes to make sure that child graduates from high school. What they do from there is something we can support as well. But we work hard to get to that point, and it has the greatest reward. We have students that cross our threshold into our school who have never learned how to follow a rule. But we assume that when a child comes to school at 5 or 6 years old that they know how to follow a rule. When they're kindergartners, I can tell you, they do not know how to follow rules. We have to teach them, like, how do we walk in the hallway? How do we make sure that we're not picking our nose and wiping it on our neighbors? And in special education, you know, we have to be that deliberate in how we're teaching kids. I mean, it seems simple, but it's thinking outside the box. I never would have thought that you had to teach kindergartners how to walk down a hallway appropriately. But the first time I saw a kindergartner stop while the line was moving, this kindergartner stopped to tie his shoes and they all dominoed over him. I thought to myself, oh, that's why we teach how to walk in a hallway. Special ed's very similar. For kids that have behavior or conduct disorders, we can't assume that they know why it's important to be quiet or, you know, why it's important to keep their hands to themselves. We teach that. And in special education, we get to teach those things all day long. And we envelop it into our instruction as much as possible. But if we need to do small group social skills instruction or instruction around behavior particularly, we have the freedom to do that. And we also have the expectation that we do that. We have a lot of laws that govern special education, but if you have this mindset and realizing that they just should have it, they should be equal, they should have opportunity, then it doesn't feel like this extra thing or this different thing. It's just part of our day-to-day work in a school and working with students. So anybody who would come to me saying, hey, I'm thinking about being a special educator, I'd say, do it. It is so rewarding and it's so awesome, and it's this great feeling when your student finally figures out whatever their challenge was. And there are some students that we'll work with year after year after year. There are also students that we fill whatever their gap is and release them from special education because they don't need those services anymore. So it is just such creative thinking, it's teamwork. It requires a lot of problem solving, but more than anything, it's just giving the kids what they deserve.
Last question, at least for me. What are one or two misperceptions about special ed teachers that you'd like to clear up for the record?
The first one is paperwork. Paperwork is definitely the number one misperception. Again, it comes down to organizational systems on that end. Organizational systems and making sure that you're planning for conferences. If you're waiting until the last minute, that will certainly feel stressful. I would say that the other is that all of our kids have learning challenges. And we have 13 eligibility categories for special ed according to federal law. And even between those 13 eligibility categories, disabilities manifest themselves in a million different ways. So, if I have those 5 kids with learning disabilities, how they're going to learn and respond to instruction is going to be different between all 5 of them. And recognizing that they're individuals and they're not this label that we've slapped on them to try to plan for them better goes a long way. And I think there are some eligibility categories that genuinely scare people, and they will not articulate it necessarily, but you can see it in working with them. Particularly emotional disabilities are a challenge for teachers, but it's because they're not supported and trained in the right way to know how to respond well to a child that has an emotional or behavioral disorder. And then recognizing too that it's about skill building. When we build those skills, that label, that ED label doesn't matter anymore. And the only reason the label is there is so we can give them additional services. So I think the biggest misperception is definitely the paperwork, and then others that we have eligibilities that are impossible or that we can't serve would be one. But it's a matter of skill building for teachers and helping them understand how disabilities manifest.
I just threw that one in, so thanks
Yeah.
for answering.
I actually have a question. So you're an alumni of ITF,
Yes.
right? What would you say was the biggest contributor of your success from your training during PST or as a fellow?
As a fellow, the thing that contributed most to my success was my coach. I think the way that the teaching fellows work is that we have this wraparound support as we're learning to teach while we're teaching. And to have somebody that was coming into my classroom and giving me feedback, even on my worst day, even if I had a day where my classroom was in crisis the entire day because we just had some really tough challenges, I had a coach that would come in and say, it is okay, and here's what we can do to make this better if we have this situation again. And then on the days that we had big wins, to be in my classroom celebrating with me and my students was great, because my students knew that I had a coach, just like I was my students' coach. And so it was normalized to have Chris in my classroom, who was my coach. And I think that's what separates the teaching fellows from traditional prep programs, is once you actually get into the classroom, you have somebody who's side by side with you, struggling with you, sharing successes with you. And when your coach gets to know your students, it's pretty cool too, to see them engaged with your students as you're learning and growing as a teacher.
Nice.
And the other question I have, and then whatever you've got, is, and answer this, Scott, how would you respond to someone who said, I want to be a teacher, but I want to be a real teacher, not a sped teacher? Mm-hmm. Right? You've heard it. I saw the face. Mm-hmm. So, go.
Well, I get that probably more than what I want to hear. More often than what I actually would expect to hear it is how I should probably say that. And my response is a question-based response. Why do you think teaching in special education is different than teaching kids with general education? And a lot of times in asking probing questions, I determined that it was a mindset issue that they developed at some point in their development as a teacher. Maybe it was the program that they went through, or maybe it was a professor that they had at some point, or maybe it was that they worked with a really bad special education teacher at some point. It's certainly possible. And so their idea at some point of what special education is was formulated, and by asking probing questions, I can get to the root cause of what they actually think special education is, and then from there either correct their understanding or show them that their understanding is wrong, inviting them into a great classroom where we have general education teachers and special education teachers working side by side, to the point where students have no idea who is the special ed teacher and who is the general ed teacher, and giving them access to actually observe that great instruction goes a long way. It usually does come down to when people are like, I don't want to be a special ed teacher, their misunderstanding of what special education is. They may think that it is teaching students who have super crazy behaviors or